Welcome back to this lecture on texture and light. Now, as we'll see, these two elements of a work of art work very closely together. We'll be looking today at actual texture in works of art, thick or very fine smooth paint, as well as rough or smooth sculptural finishes. Now, all of this, though, is very influenced by what light hits it. And as we'll see, some of this may be out of our control or well within it. We will also be looking at texture and light as it is represented in painting and other illusionistic work. And for this, the artist actually has to manipulate the effect of light, and it's a key technique used by artists who can make us believe that we're looking at a feather in one part of a composition and luscious velvet in another. For both illustrated and actual texture, handling of light is most important and effective. Now, I have to admit, these two elements of a work of art are not always discussed together, but I think it's a critical combination. You must have the light to see the texture. And this is also seeing texture rather than touch it, as most works of art you cannot touch, which is the usual appeal if you think about a texture as a tactile sensation. So we're going to talk about that as well, and the whole point is that we need to feel with our eyes. Now, the first tool that I have is actually a real tool, and that is how to work with a work of art and see surfaces from a raking light. Now, a raking light is a light that comes from an oblique angle to light a surface from one strong side. Now, we happen to have a painting right here, and if you look at this from the front, in other words, if you're standing here looking at it as you would be in a museum, you would have a broad area of light hitting that. And you might be able to see that this is very smooth on top, but it's very, it seems to be textured on the bottom. Well, if I cheat and use an actual raking light and I put it here, you can see that from the side, when you actually have the light coming from the side, all kinds of added texture show up. If you're looking for that one brush stroke that you don't think is on the smooth surface, then you could move it up here and see that in fact there is. It's just not as visible from the front. So obviously they're not going to let you take the flashlight into the museum and start doing this. But if you go in a museum and you see a work on display, you can walk around to the side and use their display lights to set you up with a raking light. And sometimes you have to bend down so that you get it hitting at exactly the right spot. But it's a wonderful way to be able to see that you're actually working with a raking light and to see more actual texture than ordinarily you would be able to see. So be sure from now on, when you go to a museum or gallery, to take a little more time to appreciate the effects of light design. It's one of the primary aspects of an exhibition designer's work. When an exhibition is going up, you might imagine painting of walls, they build platforms, they're putting up those plaques, and finally they put up the work itself as the end of the project. But in most cases, the last thing that must be done is the lighting. They want to do what was planned, but then they check every stream of light against two standards, that the light is not too intense to cause damage to the work. And these are really pretty tight standards. And also that the lighting is the perfect complement to each and every work. They will set it up so that you get the best shot looking at it from the front, and that's why you need to know about raking light, so you can also get to see it with that light from the side. Now let's start talking about texture and light in art with this work. This is the work of Rodin, a French sculptor, and I think you probably recognize it. It's called The Thinker, from 1880 to 1882. Now, as a sculptor, Rodin really appreciated the role of light for his sculpture. As it turns out, he was a combination of being a very conventional sculptor who also had some very revolutionary aspects of his art. And one of the more revolutionary was his handling of texture. Instead of smoothing out the original clay or wax that he was using, or instead of smoothing out the cast that he had created, he allowed lumps and bumps to remain, even fingerprints and fingernail scratches, all the way through to the cast. And as a result, Rodin's sculpture, for the full effect that he intended, had to be well and precisely lit. And you can look at this detail and see in the side of that arm that there are lines that do not seem to conform to human anatomy. And that's because those are cast lines, not normally exposed, but Rodin thought it important as part of the process. And you don't get to see that until you see it in the right light. So Rodin was so particular about this that he was adamant about only using one photographer to photograph his own work. This is a photograph of his work by the American photographer Steichen. It's called Balzac, Towards the Light, Midnight. It was made in 1908, and Rodin, we know, actually helped Steichen to set up these shots so that he got exactly the right lighting that Rodin had in mind. I'll show you one more. This is another Steichen photograph, and it happens to be of Rodin and the Thinker. This was done in 1906. And so he would have advised and helped Steichen make this composition. It actually shows Rodin in silhouette on the left, looking at the Thinker, and that's another Rodin sculpture in the background. Now let's start by looking at actual texture and light. Painting texture, of course, can give you a huge range of texture from very thin to extremely thick paint. This is the work of John Kensett. He's an American artist. It's called Lake George, and it dates from 1869. And Kensett was one of a group of artists who wanted a very particular effect for their painting. And what they did to accomplish that was they used very thin-downed paint, which means they could have added turpentine to it, or they used a lot of glazes and very small brushes. So the application of paint here, and remember, we're looking in reproduction, so we don't see any texture, but really the actual painting has almost no texture on the surface. It's like a glass-like surface instead. And this was the point of the movement that Kensett was involved in. It was a movement that was only named later by art historians as Luminism. And you can tell by that title, Luminism was a movement in American painting that had to do with light and luminosity. They used the landscape as a vehicle for not only emotion, but actual meditation, almost like a transformational or transcendental experience by looking at these perfectly clear, timeless images. They rarely had figures in the works, and a lot of times they were misty, like Kensett's work, or at high noon with bright sunlight and no clouds. So adding to this no texture to the canvas helped with that effect. It was a glassy surface that kind of matched this pristine stillness of the view itself. Now the opposite extreme is a work by an Impressionist. This is Monet, a French artist. It's called Haystack, End of Summer from 1891. And here you see a buildup of thick paint. It was thick already to begin with, and then Monet applies that in small strokes over and over. So look at the haystack in the front, for example. You can tell that that's layered different colors, and all of that is built up paint. This is called impasto. Impasto, just think of the word paste, and you'll think of thick paint. It's a buildup of thick paint, and it's a practice that we'll see later started in the 17th century. Now, if we look at sculpture, well, all sculpture is real, it's physical, so it has an actual texture. And it has different effects with different textures. There's a translation of actual tactile senses, or the memory of it, even as we visually read the work of art. Let's start with this work by Donatello, an Italian artist. It's called David. And what we're looking at here is cast bronze. It's from 1425 to 1430. And in this, you can contrast texture. You have a wonderful contrast here between the very smooth skin of the boy and the very textured part of his hat on the top and the head of Goliath on the bottom. And in this case, the difference in texture actually helps us to understand the meaning of the sculpture, because in this case, Donatello made a very, very young, almost adolescent David. And so the smoothness of his body really portrays that very well. And we know that the moral of the story was that David would not have been able to slay the giant, Goliath, if he hadn't been on the side of God. Let's look at this other work, and this is a favorite of mine. This is Bernini's, an Italian artist, Medusa, from 1636. This is an image of the Greek mythology monster who was punished by having her hair turned into snakes. And here it's carved out of one piece of marble. It's quite a feat. And you'd think at first that you have the same contrast of texture that we just saw in the Donatello, very textured versus smooth. And partly he has to do that to distinguish the face of Medusa from her snakes, to make the point of the horror. But here he can't make it quite as textured as that Goliath figure, because if he did, it wouldn't capture the light properly. We wouldn't be able to see the snakes as slimy. That's really the image that we're going for here. So there is some texture introduced, and some areas where it's meant to capture the light, it's left smooth. So we have this horrific image of slimy, textured things, all carved from a single block of marble. Now, there are other ways that sculpture can get us to have aesthetic, tactile reactions, and this is a great example. This is a work by Merit Oppenheim. She's a Swiss artist. It's called Fur-Covered Cup, Saucer and Spoon, from 1936. And when you look at this, did you first kind of go like this and smack your lips? Imagine what your reaction would be when you're really looking at the actual work and not at a reproduction. So you're actually looking at that fur. This is that idea of a tactile sensation by simply looking and appreciating texture. Now, types of texture in sculpture are different, and I'd like to address that with the role of light. This is a work by Louise Nevelson, an American. It's called Black Wall from 1959. And what this is found objects. She would go around constantly and collect old spools, banister railings, all to put together into boxes that she builds. Now, if she had left those all wooden objects, like the banister rail, the texture would have been the wood. But instead, she puts these all together and then paints them a single color. So she's really changed the texture of the work. We actually read these. The texture itself is this combination of the objects rather than the homegrown texture of the objects themselves. One other interesting experiment is this work by Brancuș, a Romanian artist. And this is called Sculpture for the Blind, done around 1920. And at this time, Brancuș did a lot of sculpture very much like this, egg-shaped and always almost polished in marble. But in this particular case, he meant to have it displayed in a bag, a soft bag, so that you could actually do more than just look at it. You could put your hands in and feel that sculpture, hence the title, Sculpture for the Blind. Now, there's also the fact that we have in sculpture, in real sculpture, the fact that it always will have light involved and texture because sculpture does exist. It always casts its own shadow. This is a work by Alexander Calder, an American artist. It's Sumac 5 from 1953. And I like this photo of it because you get a double effect of light and shadow with the actual mobile up above, which remember turns a little bit, and then casting this wonderful, almost like a second whole sculpture in terms of the shadow and light. Now, another interesting aspect of sculpture for our discussion is actually using light as sculpture and having it establish its own texture. It's kind of the reverse of the usual cause and effect relationship. You use the light to see the texture. But in this case, recently, there's been a use of light itself as a medium. Recent art has actually used light to as a projection to create illusions. And projected light has decorated whole buildings for a temporary installation. This is just one example. It's a work by Dan Flavin. It's untitled, and in parentheses, To Donna, from 1971. And you got to figure out what you're looking at first. What this is fluorescent tubes suspended across a corner of the gallery. And here he uses those tubes as the physical sculpture, but the real sculpture is also the reflections you see on the wall. So be on the lookout for these. Sometimes they just seem to happen on the sides of buildings and in corners of museums. So we've gone from real art in real light, outdoor light, the Rodin we started with, to real light as art. Now I want to turn to representation of texture and light. Again, light is an illusion in all kinds of illusionistic work. Represented texture is not actual texture. So we need to review a couple of things first before talking about represented light. One is just to remember that color has value. You can go from light to dark and high to low. And so we see a lot of this in really good illusionistic art that actually gets us to think we are looking at different textures. This is a work by Ingres, a French artist, and it's called Grand Odalisque from 1814. And as we look at this, we can see this is a wonderful cornucopia of different kinds of textures here, and we really enjoy reading them as such. But how does he do that? Well, let's look at a detail of just the fan that the model has in her hand. And look at the difference between the handling and the use of light in those pearls, those little baubles that are on the fan, and the feathers. Now, the baubles are hard and they're also shiny. So in real life, they would reflect that light very carefully and very clearly. We would see light reflecting back to us. And this is illusionism. It's always the case that in illusionism, the artist takes what we have experienced in nature and then gives it back to us. We make the connection to say, well, that is, in this case, it's shooting off a lot of bright white, so it must be hard and it must be shiny. And so you'll notice that in every one of those pearls, there's a use of really bright light as if it is a piece of light that's hit the hard, shiny surface and bounces off. Now, look at the feather. The feather is a natural object, and it doesn't have any hard and shiny surfaces. It doesn't reflect light, it actually absorbs light. So you'll notice that the artist here has used some yellow streaks to show those individual parts of the feather, but there's no use of bright white because there's no reflection going on. Now let's look at one other part and see how this works. These are the curtains that hung behind the model. And as we look at that, we get definitely the feeling of texture, and we get that feeling because of the use of light. What we're seeing here is that the light where the folds come out, the light is hitting there. We see it as bright light. That means that that fabric must be fairly thin, it must have a sheen to it, and it has to be somewhat shiny. But look again, it's not the case with the flowers that are on that. And that has to be another kind of texture, like embroidery. Now, how can we really tell this? Look at one of those long folds that is hit by that strong light. And while he's creating that, he's using two different values of blue, right? He's got the light blue that is being contrasted with the darker blue in the folds. And as that white light goes through and it hits a spot where there's embroidery over it, well, embroidery doesn't have a sheen. It's, again, a softer thread. And so it actually absorbs the light. So you see that streak of light hitting the blue curtain itself, but then not being as strong when it goes towards the embroidery. It's amazing what artists can do. I want to show you one more. This is by Janet Fish, an American artist. It's called After Leslie Left, from 1983 to 84. And you look at this and say, my heavens, that's amazing. How does the artist do this? Well, the artist has to always think about how something feels and translate that sensation through the use of light and dark to recreate how we see that texture, with an emphasis on how it feels for us to go from pure visual sensation to making that tactile connection. And here, Fish is known for working with very bright and glassy surfaces. And so she's tried to translate the cool feel of the glass, and also we've got plastic there, is evoked here by flickering, but also long lines of white drawn across the underlying color of the glass or plastic. Notice that there's some black coffee in the cup, and there are no strokes of white at all there. Just the brown of the coffee stands out. If you look closely, you'll see a pink reflection on part of the surface of that coffee, but it's not white. So we read the reflection as more tactile liquid. Now let's look at the representation of light. A review maybe is necessary with atmospheric perspective. Remember that the quality of light seen is affected by the atmosphere in between close objects and those that are far away. So the difference results in objects close by looking more distinct, but also lighter and cooler in color. And also we have the effect of shading, the representation of objects in light. All of this involves light. Let's look at this work, Renoir, a French artist, French impressionist, and the title is The Great Boulevards from 1875. It's a rather difficult work because it is so blurry. There's really only one thing in the painting that we think of as being in clarity and in clear light, and that would be the horse drawing the carriage coming towards us. But look first at the shadow here. You have a very large shadow that encompasses some of the figures on the left, and it's coming presumably from the building that is on the left and out of the sight. Look at that use of color in the shadow. Monet was known for talking about nature as having no true blacks, so they definitely never used chiaroscuro. And Renoir said, no shadow is black, it always has a color. And look at that front shadow. It is a melange of blues, purples, there's some lighter yellows and whites in there, and all of that gives a much more natural impression of shadow. But then the artist also has to think about the figures that are in shadow. So you'll notice in comparison to the horse figure and the figure right next to her, looks like a nun, they are more brightly colored and they are not in shadow. So they are, in fact, the only more clearly lighted figures in the whole painting. Now I want to talk a little bit about light and dark and the use of contrast between that. This is George de la Tour. He's Franco-Netherlandish in his nationality, and this is St. Joseph in the carpentry shop. It's from 1645. What you see here is what's called tenebrism. Tenebrism is strong contrast of light and dark, and it was introduced in the 17th century when this work was done. It's where light was often used as a symbol for the divine, which we'll return to when we talk about symbolism in painting. And here the only light emanates from the candle held by the small child, who is, of course, Christ. And everything else is thrown into darkness because of that. Now, this is a very dramatic image of tenebrism, so I want to show you one more. This is Caravaggio, The Conversion of St. Paul, from 1600 to 1601. And this shows the moment of conversion when St. Paul, who is originally a Roman soldier sent out to persecute Christians, but he was converted by a sign from God. And again, the light which struck him from his horse is that sign. And this is also tenebrism, because the light is so strongly contrast that everything else that's not within that beam of light is cast into complete darkness. So let's sum up. Let's show together as a summation two of the sculptures, and we'll review that difference in texture and what happens with it. This on the left is Barbara Hepworth. She's an English artist, and it's called Vertical Forms from 1968. And the work on the right is by a Swiss artist, Giacometti, appropriately called Dog, from 1957. You'll notice that this work on the left is very smooth. Work on the right is very textured. Now, we reviewed all sculpture involves texture and relies on light to reveal that texture. But look what's happened depending on what that texture is. The smooth surfaces in Hepworth's work are also shiny, smooth surfaces. So what happens is that when light hits it, you end up with large, flat planes of light. And that's always understood and intentional on the part of the artist. On the other hand, with Giacometti's dog, you do have one area, his long neck, that seems to collect a little bit of that strength of light, but all the rest of it, he's really quite mottled, the poor fellow. Most of that deep texture is instead reflecting and refracting light, so what you get is flickering highlights of light. So it's a way that, again, light works with texture to give us different approaches. And then summing up for painting, let's look at this work, a work by the Italian artist Titian. It is called La Bella, and it's from 1536. And here we have, again, this is like the Ingres example. There's a use of different values, and here it's definitely values. He also does not use chiaroscuro, to give the effect of shadow. And it builds depth, but it also gives this sensory effect of different textures, even though it's all an illusion. Now look at the difference in the texture in the dress itself, that kind of blue-green dress, and the texture of the sleeves, which were all obviously velvet. As we look at the texture of the dress, and if we look at the whole painting, we see it as if it's giving off, again, a kind of sheen. Now, it's not that really bright surface that we saw in the Hepworth, but it's still giving off a sheen. So we can imagine that this must be silk. It's a broad wash of light. So it must be silk or some kind of fabric that gives that kind of reflected light. But let's look now more carefully at the velvet. Velvet, again, like Ingres' feather, is not a kind of surface that would reflect a lot of light. Instead, it absorbs it. And I think this detail shows you a wonderful difference there, because when you look at the velvet part, you can see that they're just very tiny colors applied. And then notice the difference with the gold thread that runs through it. You're talking about gold thread, it's again shiny, it's a more hard surface, so it is done with these highlights to make that distinction. It's really a beautiful evocation of different texture by means of light, all a remarkable illusion. Tools of this lecture. Notice how texture is created. Walk around a sculpture and imagine what it would feel like to touch. They won't let you touch it. Is it smooth or is it rough? For a painting, try using a raking light or stand at the extreme edge of the picture to see whether the actual texture of the paint is thin and smooth or thick and textured. Imagine what it would feel like. Again, they won't let you touch it. In a painting, how are soft objects like fabrics and feathers made to look soft? Are there little dabs of white paint that suggest hard or shiny surfaces? Notice how light is used. Can you see where the light is supposed to be coming from? How are shadows used? Do they create a sense of mass and volume or a sense of mystery? Are shadows gray and black, or are they just darker shades, darker values of the other colors? Are there strong contrasts between light and dark in this work? So ask yourself, how does the artist's use of texture and light working together affect my response to this work? Now, the next lecture, we are going to have a shift for us as we look in particular at genre. And remember, genre in this case means what type of work, what type of art we're looking at. So we will begin with drawing.